Welcome to Tangents. I'm Jerry Brito. I'm Executive Director of Coin Center. And with me today, I'm very happy to have Daniel Rothschild, who is Executive Director of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Hello, Dan.
Hey, Jerry. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And if anybody detects something weird here, Dan's a very good friend of mine. And so that's why this thing is going to be, just sound awkward the entire time.
Having a conversation with you that's fit for public release is a little bit of a strange feeling, but we'll have to see how it goes.
Yeah. So, Dan, the reason wanted to have you on is to talk to you, executive director to executive director. Like you, I've spent my whole career in public policy and in particular in think tanks. So before starting Coin Center just over 6 years ago, which is amazing, I was at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for almost 10 years. And before that, I was at the Cato Institute. And you, this is your second tour of duty at Mercatus. And before that, you were at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. So I think you two have been in think tanks basically essentially your whole adult career, right?
Yeah, and I was at the R Street Institute between the time I was at AEI and at Mercatus. So I kind of had three different experiences in three very different kind of intellectual research think tank environments. Okay. And I've done a whole bunch of different jobs within each of these institutions.
Right. And so what I wanted to talk to you about, and I hope it's interesting to our viewers, is we're in a really weird time, really weird moment for policymaking and for the things that think tanks do to try to influence policymaking. So I just wanted to explore that with you. And maybe we could start off by you telling us, how does policymaking take place? Or maybe how did policymaking take place? And so start with that, yeah.
So I think that the kind of old story and all of these are stylized facts. They're stylized stories, so they're not 100% true. But it went something like this: research would be done by academics, and it would kind of bounce around in the academy for a while. And academics would go to think tanks, or people in think tanks would read academic papers and start to think about how do you apply some of these ideas. And then at some point there was, depending on what metaphor you wanted to use, the Overton window shifted, or if you're into John Kingdon's kind of thing, the policy stream went in such a way that ideas on particular policies could come out of think tanks and enter the public discourse. And this was either something where they were taken up by a particular politician or by someone who had the ear of politicians. So think of someone like Steve Forbes on tax policy. And then that became something that became a big policy issue and a political issue. And I use those two terms relatively interchangeably at this point in time, because politics was to a large degree about the implementation of policy ideas. So you think back to the 2000 presidential election, for instance, I can tell you even now, basically what Al Gore's policy positions were and what George Bush's policy positions were. And the debate that they had was to a large degree over those policy positions. So think tanks played this important intermediary role between the academy and between in implementation and public policy. Well, fast forward. The role that think tanks, as well as a lot of other intermediating institutions, play right now is completely different, or in many cases non-existent compared to what it was 20 years ago. I can't really tell you what the presidential election that we just concluded was based on in terms of policy differences, in terms of the major policy ideas that were put out by the two major campaigns. I can probably tell you more about campaigns from 100 years ago than from what we have right now. So we've seen this decoupling, if you will, between policy and politics, and this decoupling between academic ideas and the implementation of ideas. And all of this has made the position of think tanks at worst precarious, but I think in a more optimistic direction, up for grabs going forward.
So if politics is no longer about policy, and I concur completely with you, I mean, I guess we still, I guess policy is still enacted in the sense that government does stuff on a daily basis, and if that's and that stuff is policy. But to the extent that, look, when people are running for Congress, or the different arguments that they're having in the discourse, as you say, in the pages of opinion. It's rarely these days, if you really take a look, about policy, right? So if it's not about policy, what is it about these days?
So my mental model of this, and I'm open to challenge on this, is that there's basically two different types of policy discourse. There's high policy discourse and there's low policy discourse. And these names are a little bit perhaps incorrect. But high policy discourse is the stuff that the media covers. It's the stuff that is basically, as Robin Hanson would talk about, the fighting about the cultural status of different groups. It's only secondarily or tertiarily about policy. So we talk about things like for instance, Second Amendment rights and gun owners' rights. Mm-hmm. We talk a lot about it in terms of policy, but we like to think about it in terms of policy. But really, what it's about is owning guns, is shooting, is hunting, is having a gun culture lifestyle, something that is acceptable in America. And broadly speaking, the right wants to say this is a relatively high status thing, it's acceptable, and the left wants to say your lifestyle is unacceptable. You can't be doing this kind of thing. And to make gun ownership a low status kind of activity. And yes, there are policies that happened at the margin, but the through line of the last 15 years is just not a whole lot has changed in terms of gun policy at either the federal or the state level. So that's high policy. And then there's low policy. This is the stuff that the media doesn't cover. This is the stuff that most politicians don't know actually very much about. This is the stuff that actually has an impact on people's lives. This is the stuff that where you actually can see positive sum solutions. And this is really where think tanks continue to shine. This is where having specialized expertise, for instance, in things like fintech and blockchain technology, that really matters. I don't think that in any time in the near future, we're going to see the major journals of opinion, major presidential candidates staking out detailed policy platforms around Bitcoin and the blockchain. But the work that's happening here is really, really important. And it's in the kind of low politics realm of things.
Right. So in the high politics, to the extent that Bitcoin or cryptocurrency would get covered by the media, be part of the discourse, and we'll get to that maybe in a minute, it's going to be, there is this hack, or there are these drug markets, here are these bad things. Once in a while, it might be some feel-good story. But that's generally going to be it, where the nitty-gritty about given that there's good stuff and there's bad stuff, and we have to balance these things, where do we set the dials on which thing, that doesn't get covered, and nobody runs on that, right? And nobody in Congress calls a hearing to talk about that, and nobody in Congress gives a speech about those things. They give a speech about the high policy.
Right. And the high policy stuff is basically whether or not blockchain and Bitcoin entrepreneurs should be high status or low status, whether or not they are great innovators who are helping to develop the next technology that's going to have economic ramifications, or whether or not you wave your hands and talk about the dark web and whatever else.
So why? Okay, well, where does that come? Where does this high status, low status come from? Why do you? Okay, why?
I mean, that's a great question. If you talk to someone like Robin Hanson, again, this is something that the politics has always been about. It's been about the varying status of different groups. But I think that and there's always been this kind of status thing that's been built up in the policy debate. So these two things have never, they've always been connected. But what we're really seeing is that they have been bifurcated over the last, 5-10 years, something like that, as politics becomes more about tribalism and entertainment and a lot of other stuff that Martin Gurry and others have written about. The work of actually making policy still happens, but it doesn't happen in developing policy platforms for parties. Right. A lot of that agenda setting, a lot of that developing policy ideas that can actually be implemented is stuff that's done on the think tank level or by people in the intellectual and research environment. Right. And I think that's really the story of the Trump administration policy-wise in a lot of ways. The stuff that was really high profile that he ran on in 2016, immigration, tariffs, trade, he found very little think tank support on a lot of those things. But the stuff that he ran on in 2020, the stuff that aren't you excited about what I did, it was regulatory reform. It was healthcare, which was a lot more smoke than fire. It was judges. It was stuff that came out of think tank and think tank-like institutions that were implemented at kind of the median level or the medium levels of the executive branch. So that policymaking did happen. It was just nowhere to be found in the 2016 presidential race, and it certainly wasn't to be found in the 2020 GOP platform, which didn't exist.
That's right. It literally didn't exist for viewers or listeners who don't know this. They literally voted, the platform committee, I guess, voted not to adopt a platform. And it's just, I mean, because what's the point, right? We're not running on a platform anyway, right?
Yeah. That's the low policy detail, and that'll be figured out by the think tanks and the deputy assistant secretaries. But that's not the stuff that gets people excited. It's not the stuff that turns out people for rallies. It's not the stuff that gets low dollar donors to open their wallets.
Right. But I want to go back to low status, high stat, or relative status of groups. Again, why? What does that mean? Here's what I take it to mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that when we say that politics is about status, you're going way back to the savannah, right? And you're saying that you have, humans are tribal by nature, and that it's in our nature to have to try to raise the status of our coalition or our group, and to lower that of others. Is that your point? That it's about human nature?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's always been there, and politics has always been used to some degree for that purpose. What I'm saying is that in recent years, it's been used much more explicitly and almost exclusively, at least in some areas, for that purpose. So that's really the difference that we've seen.
So I guess,
so I think that.
How do you distinguish that from Reagan versus Carter or Mondale, right? It was much more about policy, right? Mm-hmm. Certainly about Cold War policy, foreign policy. It was also about tax policy, lots of other things. So it was definitely about education. So it was definitely about those policy ideas, and people could tell you what were the different policies that they were voting on. But at the same time, you still had all the same kind of culture war stuff, didn't you? So, I mean, what's different?
Yeah, you did, and it was always there, but it was a lot more in the background. And the groups that were part of different coalitions were much less likely to be associated with a couple of things. So you have groups like the Reagan Democrats, where there certainly was a cultural play associated with that. But Reagan articulated a host of policies that he said would benefit the Reagan Democrats, and that's how he brought them over onto the team. It was not tribalism first, policy second. It was articulating a policy platform that got people to agree with you. But what we're seeing right now is that if I know what you believe, for instance, about school choice, I can say with a very high degree of probability what you believe about taxes and abortion and guns and all sorts of other things. So we've seen these hardening of these different things into these two different tribes, and they're just all at war with each other in the high politics side of it. The low politics side is still where there's a lot more opportunity to bring new evidence to bear, to engage in liberal discussion and debate, which is what think tanks were meant to do, to bring new data to bear, to bring new studies to bear. I can't recall a single major study or white paper or anything else that was brought up in the 2020 election, but that stuff still does really matter when you're working on implementing, say, policies for emerging technologies like drones. So
why did it happen? Why was this bifurcation? And I'll throw out something just so we don't. I think it's about the media environment, almost completely. I think it's about clicks. I think the high policy stuff. And just where it's funny you call it high policy, low policy, because I sort of think of like high culture, low culture, and it's kind of flipped where high policy.
Yeah, that's why I said those names might be a little bit confusing. Yeah.
So the stuff that gets you. So we have turned politics into entertainment, and that once you accept that leads you to the result that you're describing. And then the question is, well, why did politics all of a sudden become entertainment? And it became entertainment because of the media environment changed. It used to be that you had 3 networks and a local paper and et cetera. And so there was no room, and they had their certain incentives where, politics was going to be politics, but it wasn't going to be entertainment. And now that you have a million channels and you have Twitter, it becomes you can see how quickly it becomes entertainment.
Yeah, and the business model of media, which Andre Mir has pointed out and really well chronicled, has gone from manufacturing consent and the Walter Lippmann kind of sense of things to manufacturing rage.
Right.
And so that feeds into tribalism. And I don't know where all of this started and
Yeah.
where it ended or what specifically is driving it. But I know that it does represent a fundamental challenge to the kind of business model of think tanks compared to what it was 5 or 10 or 15 years ago.
Okay. So where does that leave the people who are working in low policy, which used to be pretty well enmeshed in the campaigns, let's say, or in government, right? So again, if you think of the Romney-Ryan campaign versus the Obama-Biden campaign, like both of these guys had binders and binders full of think tank people, right? Associated with them. And I think if you fast forward to this last election, that was not the case. Certainly not on the Trump side. And I wonder even in the Biden side. The Biden side just kind of seemed to just be very message driven. Message was just be cool, right? So where does that leave think tanks and people working, not just think tanks, right, but people working in the low policy, the details?
So I mean, I think that low policy is, as I said, this is a lot of stuff that really impacts people's lives, and so it is more important than ever in a lot of ways. There really is no government equivalent of someone who's going to have the kind of deep expertise that a lot of people in think tanks have, whether it's on particular issues in foreign affairs or on tax policy or whatever it might be. You've got smart people in government certainly working on these. But we saw this in the tax reform in 2017. I mean, that really did rely on a lot of work that had been done by think tanks and models that had been developed by think tanks. And the public debate on that was interesting. It was a rare moment where kind of low policy invaded high policy because the media had to pull away from talking about the Russia investigation or whatever was pushing people's buttons and actually have people come out and cover tax policy debates and explain what the distributional impacts were going to be and the growth impacts and all of that. And that's the stuff that the media would have absolutely loved to have done 10 years ago. And certainly there are parts of the media that still do that today. But in terms of what's driving the day at the New York Times or the Washington Post, it's not this kind of tax policy work. And in fact, I think we've seen a lot of people who did really good work here in the media leave over the last few years for think tanks, for different startup ventures.
But I think you got lucky with that particular example that you use of the tax policy, the last tax reform, because you had Speaker Ryan, who was there, and is sort of, which is amazing to say, of an older generation, right? And was able to bring that to bear. I'm not sure that. So okay, I guess let me ask you this question. So okay,
I mean, maybe that just was the last of the old guard, and like that's the last major policy discussion that we're going to have.
So because I also think about think tanks and their relative status in the grand scheme of things is being lowered because, what gets all the attention is the politics of it. And so I think that leads certainly many think tanks to chase clicks themselves and change what they're about. And so, we won't name names, obviously. But, if you want to, like, you sort of have to ask yourself, so think tanks also have donors, and the New York Times also has donors, right? And the New York Times is able to attract donors because it doesn't, it kind of avoids the low policy stuff, as you say. So I sort of see think tanks beginning to also try to attract donations by being engaged in stuff that is more high.
So yeah, a couple of things there. One, the term think tank is necessarily incredibly broad and covers people and covers organizations that run the gamut from effectively totally independent research centers to what are basically advocacy groups around a particular issue. So I'm kind of talking about the smart group that's in the middle. and no need to name names, but it's kind of the smart group of think tanks that have smart scholars, broad networks, have usually a broad base of donors, do work on a whole bunch of different issues, traditionally have a certain degree of intellectual heterodoxy within them. That's one thing I think that people totally get wrong about most think tanks is there's a lot of debate and disagreement within them, probably more than there is in a lot of university departments. And so they can be these kinds of fonts of idea generation where people argue about ideas and argue about policy, and you end up with better products as a result. But what does this mean for think tanks? I talk a lot to other think tank executives, and there is this pervasive idea that we got to get better on infographics. We got to do more Twitter. We got to tweet. We got to do videos. It's all this kinds of stuff that people have been saying for the last few years, and I think it's just utterly mistaken. There's no way that you're going to win any of this, win Twitter, trend on Twitter, whatever it is, with the best possible ideas. I mean, what actually gets people's attention right now? What actually drives the kind of social media narrative? It's stuff that is not only adjacent to reality. In a lot of cases, it's totally divorced from reality. Mm-hmm. And this is something that's happened on both sides of the aisle over the last few years. And policy or polling data suggests that partisans on both sides have just like radically different views of what actual reality is. And there's honestly no video that we can make that is going to get people really excited about how reforming certificate of need laws is going to increase the supply of healthcare, lower prices, and increase access in their state. There is no way to make that something that is really exciting to everybody. But that is something that you can engage and talk about through the kind of low politics means. And I think that in a lot of ways, there are more opportunities for think tanks than ever to engage in these kinds of real nitty-gritty policy debates, precisely because the media isn't trying to turn these debates into left versus right or R versus D or our team versus their team status narratives.
So, okay, there's a lot there. First, I want to go back to what you just said about what a think tank is. And you gave a very classical definition of a think tank where you're talking about it's these things in the middle, which aren't necessarily specific issue advocates, and they're not, and that they're heterodox, right? Universities without students, as someone once said about think tanks. But how many of those are left, right? And how many of those exist relative to the wide array of policy generating institutions that have just been created over the years? And I'm thinking of like Tevi Troy had a great essay. I forget the name. Something about the
devaluing the think tank. National Affairs, 2012.
That's right. It's made a real impact on me. Again, because their incentives change, think tanks that, at one time maybe were in the middle, as you say, their business model changed. And so they began to sort of, equivocate here and there. And pretty soon they were something different, right? So they didn't have as much heterodoxy as you would want. They became, more careful about what they said because of the incentives that they faced. So that's, so I think, are any real think tanks left is sort of one question. And number two, what is their relative status when you have so many of these other groups come up, which, call themselves think tanks, do things that are very think tanky, traditionally think tanky. But it overwhelms the traditional ones.
Yeah. So, first of all, I don't think that it's a bad thing that think tanks model has changed. The business model of every elite institution is in the process of changing right now. And I think what universities have as their business model is already not what it was 20 years ago. What prestige media institutions have as their business model is not what it was 20 years ago. So I think it makes sense for think tanks to come along with that. I think that look, everyone I know basically who works in think tanks believes in what they say. There's this idea outside of Washington, that people in think tanks are just paid hacks and that, for an additional $10,000, you can get someone to go over from the Heritage Foundation to the Center for American Progress and make the opposite argument that they've been making. And like that is something that basically never happens. People are engaged in the think tank world because they really care about ideas, because they like debating these kinds of policy ideas. They like doing the kind of deep but applied research that you can do in the think tank world. They like seeing that they're having an impact. And no doubt the entire world of philanthropy has changed over the last 20 years. So think tanks are just one institution that's supported by philanthropy, but you see it across the board as well. So I don't think it's a problem that think tanks have changed, as long as what they're doing is intellectually consistent with their vision and mission, and they continue to be honest.
Yeah, but so I definitely take your point, and I think it's worth highlighting, because it drives me crazy when people tell you, somebody who's worked in think tanks my whole life, whenever somebody says that I say what I say about particular policies because I'm being paid to, it drives me bananas, because it's not true. And it doesn't, what would be better for, even if you had a donor who wants a certain policy view to be put out into the world, what would be better for them? Would they want to hire somebody who doesn't believe what they're saying, but will say it for money? Or do they want to hire somebody who passionately believes what they want to be said? And that's the way it works, right? All of these groups. Were you going to say something?
Oh, no. If you know the policy that you want enacted, investing in a think tank is like the worst possible use of your money.
Yes.
If you have a vision of exactly what needs to happen, hire a lobbyist.
Yeah.
There's nothing shameful about that. Lobbyists play an important role in the ecosystem of policymaking. So go out there and support candidates and hire a lobbyist, and via con Dios.
Okay.
But if you're actually interested in the process of ideation, that's where think tank investments are powerful philanthropically.
Right. Okay. But that gets to where I was trying to go, which is a Tevi Troy point, which is that think tanks, and because their business model is changing, they look a lot more like issue advocacy groups these days than simply universities without students, right? So they have GR departments that are trying to lobby. We can't say that, right? But they do. So it's not just about getting new ideas on paper. It's about getting those ideas into law, right? And lobbying to do that. And it's about having a social media department, right? That helps in that process, but also gets attention. And if that's how the think tanks have changed, and the relative composition of the budget goes more towards GR and social media and media and whatever else, and less to simply scholarship, well, it's not okay that think tanks' business model has changed, right?
Yeah, but I think you can probably count the number of think tanks on one hand who spend more on government affairs and communications than they actually do on research and in our case at Mercatus and student programs. Right. The intellectual work of think tanks is still what drives every credible think tank. And again, if what you want to do, if you want to go viral on Twitter with the idea that that you have, there are many better investments to make than think tank Twitter accounts. So I can't name a think tank Twitter account that is particularly influential or powerful or that has millions of followers. Get Kim Kardashian to endorse you on Insta.
So, okay. So if you can't really tweet the low policy stuff effectively, to have any kind of effect that you'd want to have, how do you, convey your ideas?
So I think you can tweet it. Just don't make your measure of that tweet success whether or not it gets 500,000 impressions and 100,000 retweets. I would rather tweet something and have it read by the 8 people who are actually working on implementing an issue, who actually matter, than to have it be retweeted by 80,000 people who are paying no attention to it at all. So here's a way to think about it. When I was first at Mercatus, I was working on a project called Enterprise Africa. And we would put out policy briefs based on field research done in sub-Saharan African countries, and we would send it to the people at the relevant desk at USAID, at the Nascent Millennium Challenge Corporation, the relevant people on the relevant congressional subcommittees, and a few people at state. So like we knew the universe of people who cared about regulatory policy towards agriculture in Botswana or whatever. That was a known number of people, and we knew exactly who those people were. It is still the case on some of these low policy issues that we know who these people are and we know how to get ideas to them. It's on the high policy ideas where we no longer know these are the particular people whose opinions matter here. Because in high policy stuff, kind of it's an ecosystem that we haven't made sense of yet. So on the low stuff, being a think tank expert who's seen as one of the top few people in your area, I think that still carries exceptional returns to it. Really having that kind of expertise that you can develop as a think tank fellow, that still matters for a lot of people. And I have a lot of colleagues who are viewed as, top 5 people on their policy issue. And they get calls from across the country from state legislators, from people in governors' offices, from mayors, to talk about their areas of expertise.
Yeah. And if I can say, I think the way to leverage social media, because we live in social media these days, is not to institutionally try to, create snazzy products that will go viral, right? Like, oh, we have to go viral. Yes, if you could only plan and execute on virality. But the way to do it is the scholars themselves, or the people who are ideating, is every field and subfield has its own Twitter. Yeah. And I think there's a way to responsibly participate in that. It's very hard, increasingly hard, I think, depending on your field. But I think that's a way to do it. And then as a result, I think you do become recognized in your field. And that's a good way to engage with others with different ideas, et cetera. It's difficult to do responsibly oftentimes because of the nature of social media. And then the way you measure that success, again, is not virality. It's about, what connections do you have, and how you affect the discourse, which more and more is happening on social media.
Yeah, and affecting the discourse, and this is another thing that I think that people get wrong about think tanks, is not about having people in government read your ideas and say, I want to write a bill based on that. Sometimes that happens, but it is more about affecting the larger discourse. It's about framing the conversation around which these things occur. And that's where I think is the interesting opportunity for think tanks in high politics and high policy going forward. We effectively have no agenda-setting institutions as a country anymore. I don't think that this is unique to the United States. We were talking earlier about how the GOP literally didn't even write a platform this year. They didn't even say, if elected, here are the things that we are going to do. The media, tries to set an agenda, but by and large, they only set it for one half of the country. Because think tanks have this intellectual heterodoxy built in, because think tanks tend to view one another, even across kind of ideological divides, as good actors. And there are people that, go between different think tanks and do different kinds of work. I think there's an institutional opportunity for think tanks to answer or play a role in answering the question that I think is at the root of a lot of our ennui today, which is, what does it mean to have a good society? And I think that we should have more think tanks kind of jumping in and saying, like, the kind of view that I think that most of us would take at Mercatus is, look, a good society is one where people's individual rights are protected, that's innovative, that's dynamic, that's forward-looking, that is cosmopolitan, that's pluralistic, so that different people in different areas can have different policies and different statuses that support them. It's one that has a rich, robust civil society. I think that we've got to have a serious discussion about kind of how we rebuild that. And a lot of think tanks are starting to work on this space. So a lot of these really big issues that do matter, that should matter, about what the world is going to look like, not just what are the policy things that are being done to raise or lower the status of this group. I think that these are really important conversations to have. So, one of the things that I think is really exemplary of the Trump administration approach to this is, we all remember the carrier jobs thing from, it was, I think, shortly just after the election, maybe before he was inaugurated.
Yeah, I think it was before he was inaugurated, yeah.
He went to the carrier plant in Indiana and he said, we're going to save these jobs. Well, a few journalists have done follow-ups on that and found that most of these jobs have actually moved to Mexico and all of that. And then they asked the question, why is it that people, still support Donald Trump after all of this? And what he did was he went there and he said, you are not low status people, that you matter. People with a high school education who are earning a decent wage and taking care of the families, these are people who actually matter. You are high status. And so I think that rather than just making this a status game between whether or not blue collar workers at the carrier plants in Indiana matter, it's articulating a vision of a good society where people like that and people with college degrees in Indianapolis and people who are left behind educationally and the whole panoply of 340 million Americans, what is the society that we should be aiming towards? Again, with this emphasis on pluralism, recognizing that the policies enacted in Indiana and the policies enacted in New Jersey are probably going to be very different.
Yeah, I wish I could share your optimism because I think what's difficult is going to be for a think tank that has developed a good vision of society to bridge the gap to the high politics, right? Sure, maybe if you're lucky, Ben Sass will run and take a lot of good ideas from think tanks and et cetera. But how's he going to do in a field that includes Donald Trump, right? Or let's say it doesn't, let's say Ben Sass is running against Matt Gaetz, right? I guess I'm kind of allowed to name names a little bit. It's when politics has become wrestling, WWE style wrestling. I don't see how you translate that, right? I guess you can write the script for a really, sort of upstanding character that comes in, but I don't see how that character wins.
So I think where I part with you here is, yeah, politics may be wrestling right now and it may be tribal and the rest of it, but the politics of negation only goes for so long. Mm-hmm. I don't think that this is an equilibrium that's going to last for another 20 or 30 years.
I agree.
And this is a point that others have made is what we're going through is in a lot of ways like what happened when the printing press came into existence. Yeah. And the entire ordering of society was kind of jumbled. This won't be the equilibrium forever. We're going to learn how to live with social media, with the decommodification of information, with the disintermediation of experts. We're going to have new institutions that emerge to fill those roles. And I think that's the argument that I'm making. It's not saying that this is something that think tanks are doing right now, but I think it's something very profitable that think tanks can be doing over the course of the next generation, because political parties are not going to stand up to do that. And almost every other elite institution in religion, media, academia are so associated with one side or the other that none of them have the ability to kind of bridge across those divides.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you that the status quo is not sustainable and that something's going to have to give. And I also think that it's a worthwhile thing for think tanks to do, to develop the thinking for what could possibly, be the successor, status quo. That all said, you kind of underlying your optimism is sort of the assumption of progress, right? You can just take a giant step back. The way that this is, it's not sustainable and something has to give. Maybe it gives and it's a giant step backwards. So anyhow, I don't have much more to say, but I'm not super optimistic that some think tank, plan about what a good society looks like, because we already know what that is. And the problem isn't that we don't know what a good society is. It's that we don't have shared sense making anymore, I think, is the problem. And you're kind of right that I guess you're saying, all these different institutions, from political parties to religious institutions, are now associated with one side or the other. And I think implicit in that, you're saying, well, think tanks aren't. Think tanks can still be above the fray. But I'm sorry. The people who work at that carrier plant, they probably don't see think tankers as on their team, whatever that team, even though that team is kind of a amorphous thing. Maybe sometimes it's Bernie, sometimes it's Trump, but they certainly, I don't think, would see them as part of their team or no team.
That's true as far as it goes, but I don't think that there's anything. In fact, if you look at trust rankings in America, it's basically only the small business sector and the military that have widespread bipartisan support. There's no other institutions that have more than 60% support across both political parties. But a couple of things. So one, this is a time where think tanks are redeveloping a business model.
What you're saying is that we should have a military takeover of the nation.
Those were your words, not mine, Jerry. I suppose you're going to advocate for that takeover being done on the blockchain.
Right.
Hey, look, I think so. So most people in America don't know what think tanks are, what think tanks do, and most people in America don't, read the work of think tanks, and that's absolutely fine. It's not the case that liberalism broadly construed has ever been a mass market movement. It's always been something that's been an elite movement. The question is, how do we make it appealing more broadly? Not just to people who work in the carrier plant, but to the people who are preaching to them on Sunday mornings, to the people who are seen as leaders in the community. There are still it's not nihilism all the way down. There are still liked and respected people across the United States. They just happen to not be on the Acela corridor anymore. And that drives people in the Acela corridor crazy. But I think the question is, what is the viewpoint that's going to be had more broadly by elites across America, not elites as have existed for the last 50 years?
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right that liberalism is an elite-driven movement or ideology, and the public has kind of come along, partly because of lack of choice, right? Because it's sort of elite-driven, as you say. But what's happening is, in large part due to the media environment, you have a democratization of speech and of just about everything. And so if it's an elite-driven movement, but you have just huge democratization, the elite-driven movement kind of don't do well in those. And the new elites that you're saying we should be able to appeal to, they're very populist because they're elites because they derive their status from the people. And so they're not going to try to lead by leading. They're going to lead the way you jump in front of a parade.
But again, negation only goes so far. The politics of negation and nihilism, it can't go on forever. Eventually, someone is going to have to say what they're for. Yeah, and this is where I think that I talk a lot to my colleagues about people's pre-political mental models. And their pre-political normative commitments. Yeah. What is it that people want out of? What is it that people think is the appropriate role for policy to play? And all of the other important institutions in society. What's the important role for the academy? What's the important role for communities, for grassroots groups? What's the important role for religion to play? What's the important role for businesses, both large and small, to play? I mean, we've got to talk through all of this. You can't just negate everything forever. And because think tanks can play this kind of medium-term game, because think tanks can think about stuff 10 years into the future, I think that we are better suited than any other kind of institution to be thinking about what's the kind of society that we want in 2030. We don't know who the political players are going to be. We don't know who the parties are going to be. But how do we have a real conflict of ideas and a real a discussion about being focused on sustaining the past versus innovating into the future? How do we think about the relationship between production and distribution? I mean, these are important questions, and we can't just wish them away forever.
Yeah, well, I for one am glad that you and the folks at Mercatus are out there doing the Lord's work, trying to figure out what the positive agenda is. I'm afraid that, however, that as you say, negation can't go on forever. At some point, somebody's going to have to say they're for something. And that's something that's going to be, we need to water the crops with Bronto, right? Anyhow, Dan, thank you so much for coming on Tangents. It's been a pleasure to have you. And I don't know if we resolved anything, but at least I hope people get a better sense of what the people like us who develop ideas to try to get policy that affects real people, how we're thinking about our jobs these days.
Like any think tank podcast or event, the baseline is that we raised awareness.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks for having me.